back to the Trump report card, or I'm sorry, the orange man, 45. The Trump administration has been very successful.
I don't think so.
One thing he's been successful at, gets another A+ at, is raising the number of hate crimes committed across America.
That's for sure.
According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, hate crimes have risen to an unprecedented level since Trump took office. On the flip side, he gets poor marks for how he's handled these racist and anti-Semitic actions and crimes committed by his supporters oftentimes, using generally very tepid statements in response. Should African-American, been jealous, I want to pose this to you, should African-American political strategists simply accept this lack of leadership around this crisis? And what seems like a profound ignorance, really, about African-American culture by this president and his administration. He even made a comment on Black History Month that suggested that Frederick Douglass is still alive.
No, he called today and thought he was going to be here. He wanted to come here and meet him.
Frederick, please come on up. Where you at, Frederick?
Who was it that said you teach people how to treat you?
Yes. Yes. Well, first of all, it's an honor to be here. As I said many times when I was president of the NAACP, there would be no NAACP without the AME.
All right,
That's right.
All right.
And this is the house of Frederick Douglass, and we'll get back to that in a second. Look, just to answer the question, and it's an honor to be in the presence of such an esteemed panel. A lot of these folks here helped raise me, if we're honest. Ron knows that. Askia knows that. My big brother, Mark. And women who I admire, like Ms. Avery Brown and Barbara Arnwine, who schooled me many times, and Dr. Malveaux. But on this issue of hate crimes, it really is like the issue of Korea. A president fails to be a diplomat, it's a big deal. And when a president encourages hate crimes, it's a big deal.
My.
Going back to Seoul for a second, Dr. King really commanded all of us to, in each of our own ways, lead against racism, militarism, and greed.
Right.
Dr. King talked about jobs, justice, and peace. We have a responsibility on all three of those things, and about half the population of Korea lives in the Seoul metro area. About 50 million people in the country, about 25 million people in the metro area. That is like New York City and Los Angeles and a bit more. So when you talk about, and the thing is, if you stand in somebody's living room there, and this is, these are middle class, upper middle class families, they live in high-rise apartments that typically have 3 generations in one apartment. So you can imagine how many families entire would be wiped out if one shell from North Korea hits one apartment building. Every apartment you will lose 3 generations.
My.
So let us pray and let us do everything we can to avoid another Korean War.
Yes.
When it comes to hate crimes, look, what our children, and my daughter's here with me, although I heard she's tuned out and watching Netflix. We'll talk about that later. But
she's heard you speak before.
Amen. Too many times. But when it comes to this issue of hate crimes, our children have paid a real price. This president has encouraged a manner of incivility that goes right down to the schoolyard. We have been making so much progress against bullying in this country. And he just comes and rips the bandage right off. And I've listened to my own children complain about how their playgrounds have become more hostile, and I remember that too many adults in our society act like children, and I know Trump has had a profound impact on our culture in all the wrong ways. But I also want to remind us that we, in this place, and it's hard to be in this church and not think of our ancestors, and they were evoked in the beginning. We have a historical imperative for our leadership that goes well beyond our own people. Frederick Douglass understood that. Frederick Douglass, 4th of July, many people will read his speech about the 4th of July. I would encourage you this year, if you only read one speech by Frederick Douglass, you read his speech, Our Composite Nationality. It was his tirade against the Chinese Exclusion Act. Mm-hmm. It's a reminder that we have lived through moments like this before. This moment, when they're seeking to, yes, suppress the black vote, but push immigrants of color out of the country and divide working people of all colors against each other.
Yes.
We have lived through before. And Frederick Douglass, in that moment, speech, Our Composite Nationality, reminded us, really set the vision in many ways for the progressive movement from there forward, not just the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement he was very supportive of, the broader movement, even the immigrants' rights movement, as he was going off about the Chinese Exclusion Act. And he said many things in the speech. He said, look, in effect, I'm going to paraphrase him because if you haven't read a 19th century orator recently, it's always a little easier. He said, look, we didn't just come through one great war to end slavery in the Southeast to watch you all enslave somebody else in the Southwest. Talking about the railroads and the Chinese and the Irish and their exploitation. And then he goes on to say, he says, look, every nation has a destiny, and its destiny is unique, and it's based on its character, and a nation's character is not that nation at its worst, but at its best. And every nation's character is ultimately grounded in its geography. And our geography is unique. He says, we are bordered by friendly nations of different races, north and south, and we're bordered by great oceans, east and west, that connect us to every people on the planet. And then Douglass goes on to say, and this part is ultimately an exact quote, that our destiny, based on our character, defined by us at our best, and grounded in our unique geography, is to be, quote, the most perfect example of the unity and dignity of the human family that the world has ever seen. That the world has, and this is a man, let's be clear, who earned the sum to purchase his freedom in Ireland, who was the guest of Irish Protestant abolitionists, but who, if you will, developed a bromance with an Irish Catholic liberation leader who was building a movement on a penny-a-year membership. If you go to Northern Ireland, you are much more likely to see a mural of Frederick Douglass than of Martin Luther King. And when you go back and you read Du Bois, then you all of a sudden you understand Du Bois was inspired by Frederick Douglass. His understanding of the anti-colonial struggle across the globe was inspired by Frederick Douglass. And I offer that to give us hope. Because fundamentally with these hate crimes, what Trump is doing is he is going back to an old playbook of let's divide the struggling masses of the country against each other.
That's right.
There's an alternative to that. And Simone and I traveled a lot together, and we saw it. And I was want to tell you one story. All of us been sort of going off and said, next year we should do this like TED Talks, to give us each our 15 minutes. But I'll tell you this. We had just won. The Sanders campaign had just won in Michigan. We had almost won in Illinois, and Missouri was up next. And we were on a roll, and we were having fun in Chicago. We were having fun in Detroit. And we were on our way to St. Louis, but we landed in the Ozarks. And I looked out the window of that plane, and I was like, where are we? And they said, we're on our way to Southwest Missouri State. I said, in the Ozarks? They said, yes, in the Ozarks. And I thought to myself, look, I used to be a reporter at the Jackson Advocate newspaper in Jackson, Mississippi. Askia and I first met back then. And I've been to a lot of places like Mississippi as president of the NAACP. The Ozarks was one I hadn't gotten to yet. And as a black man in America, that was okay with me. But there we were. So we get there, and one thing that was similar to the Ozarks was that, similar between the Ozarks and Chicago, was that we had about 7,000 people we were turning away at the door and about 6,000 inside. That's about where it ended. We got inside, I looked out the curtain, I leaned back to him, I said, the greatest diversity I see in that crowd is that 20% of the men are in deer hunting camouflage. And I said, and who's bringing out Bernie tonight? And they said, Ben, you're bringing out Bernie tonight. And I said, really? You sure you want to hear? He said, yes. I said, all right. And I walked out there sort of aware, the way, you remember going into a new classroom when you were a kid, the way when you just know you're in a totally new space you haven't been in before. And they introduced former president of the NAACP, Ben Jealous, and the applause, if I closed my eyes, was just like Detroit. I was like, this is interesting. So I walk up and I give my speech, and unfortunately, and the Trump, back at the Bernie campaign, we were talking about Trump as a threat, like in February, March. And that was a speech I gave, and the crowd was into it, and great response. And I walked out, and I said, I was just kind of dazed. And so I said, I'm going to watch Bernie give his entire speech tonight. It's a very similar speech wherever you go. So once you've heard it a few times, you usually go plan the next day and just help him win better the next day. But so I'm going to sit here and I'm going to listen to the whole thing. I want to hear if as Bernie makes each call that he made in Detroit, each call he made in Chicago, if the response is going to be the same, and it was for health care, and it was for free college, and it was for $15 minimum wage, and it was for stop the TPP, and I was getting more anxious, not more affirmed, because I knew we were coming to that place where Bernie would call for the police to stop killing unarmed black men. Mm-hmm. And this was the spring of 2016. And I was about strung out from watching unarmed black men get killed by the cops. Mm-hmm. And if the response was just a little bit off, if it was just a little bit more tepid, I knew I would be off for weeks. And you can't do that when you're sprinting in the midst of a presidential campaign. And so I swayed, and all of a sudden Bernie made the call, and the response was just as loud, and I looked out, and half of the guys, I swear they were a hunting club, because they're all on one side, deer hunting camouflage, half of them were in their chairs with their fists in the air hollering. And I stood there dazed, and Bernie eventually came off the stage, and I said, Ben, I said, did you hear that? He said, hear what? I said, the response to your applause lines was exactly the same as Detroit and Chicago, even when you called for the police to stop killing unarmed black men. And Bernie looked at me and he said, I'm glad you were there to hear that. I said, I'm glad you stayed behind to hear that. He said, that's the revolution in this revolution. And I wasn't satisfied with that. I'm a trained criminologist, bootleg, jackleg sociologist, and historian. And not preacher like Barbara, but it's a different. and I stood there. And I thought, but I said, you know what? We as Democrats, we're really good at this thing called identity politics. You send any of us, Jesse Jackson campaign, any campaign, to talk to a group, we know what we're going to say walking through the door. If it's this group, we'll talk about comprehensive immigration reform. If it's, the National League of Women Voters, we might talk about the ERA for the 40th time in 40 years. We do that to send a signal that we heard you before we got here, and therefore we hope you'll listen to everything else we have to say. Well, when it comes to working class white men in places like the Ozarks, there's only one thing you can really talk about, and that's restructuring the economy. That's what Bernie did for half an hour. He signaled that he had heard them before he asked them to be an ally to somebody else. And just like every other group in our family, once they had been affirmed for half an hour, they understood he had heard them, they were ready to be an ally to somebody else. Well, guess what? Black voters, we're swing voters too.
Yes.
We don't swing between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. No, we swing between voting and not voting. And when you look at who does not vote in the black community, our community that since Dr. King was assassinated, the black upper middle class has quadrupled in size. And blacks living in poverty have not gone down 1 percentage point on average in any given decade. They hover around half. Well, the ones who are most unlikely to vote are from the half that have been stuck in poverty. And guess what they're waiting for us to talk about too? Restructuring this economy. When we came into Maryland, I was chairing the Maryland campaign for Bernie Sanders, and we came into Maryland, I shifted our strategy at churches. I stopped going to the churches that count doctors and lawyers. We started going to the storefront churches. And all of a sudden, the skepticism about our message evaporated. Because when we said $15 minimum wage, we were talking about them getting a raise.
Yes.
And here's the thing. If we're honest, one of the beautiful things about our community is that's our family too. I found many of those churches through my cousins. We have unfinished business. We are the party, of MLK and JFK. But guess what? Both those men, and LBJ and FDR and Shirley Chisholm and Barbara McCall, Bayard Rustin, all of them were not just on fire about civil rights. They were on fire about ending poverty.
That's That's right.
And we have a responsibility to all of them
That's right.
to finish the job and expand opportunity for all of our brothers and sisters.
And Ben, let me ask you this before you move on. Given the fact that the Democrats are sort of the party of resistance now, and they're out of power, what strategy do you think they should adopt? Should they, given the history of the GOP as total obstructionists throughout the Obama administration, what strategy do you think they should employ to leverage the bit of power that they do have?
You know, look, I believe that the person who said that politics is war without bloodshed is very wise. This is an art of fighting, and the only time I was really trained to fight was in judo, and in judo, what you learn to do is use your opponent's momentum against them.
Okay.
And the jiu-jitsu in this moment is this. For 50 years, we have transferred power from the federal government to the states. The states that we do control, the states that we can't control, we must use the new powers of the states to not just for effective defense, the way Maryland has given their state's attorney general special powers to sue President Trump and to protect the state from President Trump, but also for offense. We can guarantee health care for all at the state level. We can raise the minimum wage to $15 at the state level. We can make it easier for public sector unions to organize nurses, and at the state level, we can end mass incarceration. It's primarily at the state level. And we need to get on with it. We need to get on with it. You know, one of the things that frustrated me most when I was president of the NAACP and fighting to end mass incarceration across this country is that oftentimes it was the establishment in both parties that was the problem. Mm-hmm. It was the activists in both parties who were willing to embrace the answer. We got further as the NAACP on this one issue. Let me be clear. Tea Party, we fought them on 99.9% of everything. But on ending mass incarceration, we could work together. And all of a sudden, we found ourselves going further to reduce the size of the prison population in Texas than we could in California. And so that's the other thing that we have to do as activists who understand that there's no permanent friends, there's no permanent enemies, there's just permanent interests. Activists who understand that if, you know, General Powell said that it's easy to figure out what we disagree on, but if we can figure out what we agree on, why don't we just focus on that for a second and get it done? Because there's people who are counting us to make real results happen in real time.
All right. Angelus, let me, Bill, you want to say something?
Yeah, actually.
Simone, but Simone, hold tight. Bill.
Yeah, I just want to add perhaps a point of slight disagreement. See, Verna, when you were posing the question originally, I think it's important that we are clear that the occupant of the White House was leading. And he was leading a movement that is rooted in what they call in Europe revanchism, a movement that is focused on revenge and of getting back what people allege that has been taken from them. This is a very, very dangerous movement, and it is a movement, and this is really critically important here. This is a movement that believes that the greatest mistake in U.S. history was the election of a black president in 2008.
Well.
And that as a result, see, this is where the issue of race cannot be avoided. And in working with people who are being stomped on by everything that Trump is implementing, they are still holding on to, but at least we corrected the mistake of 2008 and 2012. And we have to talk about it. We have to put this issue on the table, that these folks believe that there was that kind of mistake, and that this is correcting that. This is restoring the white republic, right? And so the politics that we come forward with has to make it clear that this issue of race cannot be avoided. And so while I agree, Ben, with this issue that you're saying about reaching out, we've got to understand that many of these so-called sincere Trump voters, and I say so-called,
Right.
that no matter how much they are stomped on, no matter how much they are poisoned as EPA is weakened, as no matter how much they are put under threat in the case of a potential war, as much as they are facing the impact of right to work, many of them will cling on to the fact that at least it's not a black man.
But Bill, if I could just, I agree with you in very large part, but I think that we also have to put this in a context that is extremely realistic about, number one, the flaws of the Democratic Party and our Democratic candidate, who quite frankly, with all due respect, and I ran around the country supporting her, ran, for want of a better word, a pitiful ass campaign. Now, there is a better word, but let me just, Reverend Lamar, forgive me, but I could make it more plain than that, and I ain't going. But in any case, we had a flawed candidate who ran a poor campaign, number one. Number two, if we look at history, we know that it is very rare that the same party keeps the White House for 3 terms. It very rarely happens. So while I think that race played a large factor, see, I'm unwilling to believe, only because I have to have a little bit of optimism in my life. So I'm unwilling to believe that all those people who voted for 45 were racist buffoons. I simply cannot believe that. Because then if I believe that, I have to go get my Roscoe and sit outside my house waiting for somebody to get on my nerves. And those of you who read my Facebook page understand that that's a very near possibility.
Then I think you should do exactly that, because I would have to fully agree with you. I think that it's easy, and it's easy to say that Hillary didn't have the right message, but let's be honest, she got the second most votes than any candidate in history. So let's at least give her her due.
No, she deserves. Well, honey, she deserves her due. She deserves her due. I wasn't finished.
No,
she deserves her due. But let's be clear. It only, as Barbara Arnwine said earlier, it was 100,000 votes or less than that.
Less than.
Detroit, Wisconsin, Philly. Sister Girl chose not to go to these places and to do the campaign that she should have done, and she ended her campaign with money in the bank. Yes, she won the popular vote, and we will give it up to her for that, but let us say that given everything we know, including the insipid racism of that man who now occupies the White House, there had to be a way for us to do more. I'm mad at my Bernie people, to be honest with y'all. I ain't that mad at y'all, but I'm a little mad at y'all.
I did my part.
You did your part. You did your part. You came around. But let us really be really clear, in the face of the triumph, the predatory capitalism, it was incumbent on Hillary Clinton, the standard bearer of the Democratic Party, to go into inner city Detroit. To go to Milwaukee, to go to Philly. Those 100,000 votes, 100,000 votes, y'all.
Yes.
100,000 votes, y'all. That is absurd. It's ridiculous. And that is so, we got to own that.
So we
you
talked
can give
about
her every
her.
prop you want to. You can give her any prop you want to.
Hold it.
Wait, I just want to know. So Mark talked about.
Hold it. Let's get a little order here. Jamira shouted first. Let's get her and Simone. I was coming to you anyway. Come on, Jamira.
So my disagreeing wasn't with you. My agreement was with him and what he said, that we can't, there's no way for us to have a full conversation about what the Democratic Party did wrong without us also recognizing that there are millions of people in America that are racist. And I'm sorry, I look at people who voted for Donald Trump, even if they say that they're not racist, but he put a target on everyone in this room back. He said that he wanted to bring back law and order. He wanted to defund public education. And so for me, my concern isn't the fact that her messaging, because I thought she could have done better. Fully agree with that. But there are people in America that are extremely racist, and they feel like this was their opportunity to elevate their voice and a concern. And there's no way we would have won those voices. No, but they are the system in place that allows for racism to exist. You don't have to be a racist as an individual, but if you are an individual supporting a system that is racist, that is racist.
Yeah. I want to come to Simone, but as I come to you, Simone, I want you to respond to this in your answer. We're still on this subject. So Dr. Malveaux mentioned the data. A study in Boston by the organization American National Election Studies took a look at Trump voters,
Right.
polled them, what have you. Trump voters were more likely to describe African Americans as criminal, unintelligent, lazy, and violent.
Exactly.
Trump voters were more likely to believe people of color are taking white jobs. And a majority of them rated African Americans as less evolved than whites. These were choices on the survey. So my question is, you know, considering what we have to do and with all we've talked about, there's this debate now about whether we deal with issues of class and economics at the expense of so-called identity politics, which is a word I actually don't like. I mean, that's actually a right-wing term that was coined to attack us. You know, don't we run the risk? I think both are important, class and race. I just want you to know my position. We have to deal with both. But haven't we done a very risky thing by sometimes emphasizing more about the economics at the expense of the racial issues, help to mobilize some of these Trump people, because a lot of these white working class males, which is an identity, by the way, ended up voting for Trump.
Got it. That's deep. I'm also glad to be here, such as everyone else on this panel. So a couple things. So one, when I am not on television, I'm a communications consultant, and one of the people I work for is Priorities USA, formerly the super PAC that supported Hillary Clinton in 2016, Obama in 12, but now they've moved to be this voter-centric, progressive service center for the left, and one of the things we do is research. So I have been in multiple rooms, more than I would have liked, with Obama-Trump voters, people that voted for Obama in 08 and 12, and then cast their ballot for Trump in 2016, and also base drop-off voters for the Democrats, folks that everyone expected to come out in 2016 that didn't come out. So I have, we poll these people like every week. So I have a unique perspective on this. But what I will say is I think the conversation between whether we choose talking about class and the economy versus quote-unquote identity politics is a false choice. And we should not continue to perpetuate the struggle between the two. Because the fact of the matter is, and one of the things that I regret that I let get away from me on the campaign in the primary is that the economy is a black people issue.
Yes.
Jobs is in fact a black people issue. And so why have we allowed the conversation to be seeded to say that when we talk about people who work 40, 50, 60 hours a week and can't make enough money to feed their families, we're talking about white people? We have to inject ourselves back into the conversation, and I think that's something the party has not done well. And frankly, because I've been up in all the buildings, I don't think they're going to get it right in the quick enough time where they need to get it right so we can be successful in 2018. So we're going to have to help. We cannot rely on our party entities from the DNC all the way down to the D-Triples, to the D-Trip, to the DSCC, to the DGA to do this work for us. We're going to have to march on into the building like I did last week. Ask you what your diversity plan is and ask you what your messaging is. So that's one thing. Two, I think on these Trump voters, we also and I hate to keep relitigating the 2016 election, but this was a change election, ladies and gentlemen. So you have to understand. And when we polled these Obama-Trump voters and we asked these folks in these focus groups, you voted for Obama in 08 and 12. What made you pull the lever for Donald Trump? They said Donald Trump was talking about change. And for 8 years, we were looking for change, and it never really came to us. So there were so many people in America for whom Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, for that matter, spoke to their reality. It's reality of people. Yes, we have had 75 straight months of private sector job growth under President Obama, but we also have folks that have lost jobs, that have not been able to make more money. And you have to be able to speak to both. And when you don't speak to the reality of the totality of everyone in America, we cannot win. And so going forward, because you asked, where does the party go from here in one of these previous questions, we haven't done an autopsy. Autopsy, let me help you, ain't about to happen. Because it's still too fresh. We don't went on a whole unity tour that don't have millennials, black people, specifically black women. As a black women that voted, black women who voted 94% to try to save this country, we ain't got a thank you card. So there's all these other things that need to happen. So in terms of going forward, I think it's going to take outside pressure, outside activists. I don't know if you've noticed, but it's the activist community that's literally leading the charge on what is happening. when Congress first came into session, you had everybody from Chuck Schumer on down to Nancy Pelosi talking about, well, we'll work with Trump where we can. You haven't heard that in a month or two, because that is not what the people on the ground want. So I think it's incumbent upon rooms like this, people who are listening across the country, and folks in your various organizations to get our strategies together and bring it to the table and push. Because the party and these democratic entities are not going to do us for us. To be frank, the progressives ain't going to do us for us. I work for them. I was in the rooms where I still got yanked out the entourage by the state troopers because they didn't believe that the black girl worked there. So we have lots of work to do, but I fully believe, and to be frank, my daddy voted for Donald Trump. God rest his soul. So everybody, and my daddy was a 64-year-old black man from Mississippi who said Hillary Clinton was a crook, and that's why he couldn't put 11 for her.
So he died after he
So,
voted
you know,
for Trump?
My daddy died another crook. Yes, he did. But you also have to, I mean, if we really want to talk about it, there's all this money on the right that the conservatives have pumped into their apparatus that they have built up over the last 10 years. So what you probably didn't know that was happening is that the Mercer family and the Koch brothers did work monitoring social media for well over a year. And they monitored people who were black people, black men specifically actually, who were posting about the campaign, and they flagged them, who were posting about politics. And anytime anybody said anything about criminal justice reform, anybody said anything about incarceration, they were flagging them. And then in the last 2 months of the campaign, they went to them and specifically messaged to them about super predators and how Hillary Clinton was bad for criminal justice reform. That literally happened. I was at a thing where they presented about what they did. There is money and a true strategy and apparatus behind this. And so on the left or the progressive or whoever you want to be today, the independents, until we get a real structure and some money and just some direction, we will not be able to catch up and win.
And Simone, I'm glad you brought up some of those points, especially about black women. That black women have voted in larger numbers than any other demographic groups in the last 3.
And the party still ain't give us our due.
Right. Yep. Right. And so we have done some polling looking at what drives black women out to vote. And you are absolutely correct. Employment and jobs is right at the top. What we're most concerned about, quality public education and health care. Those are the 3 top driving forces of driving black women to the poll. And so I don't think enough candidates are looking at that and pushing those buttons to get people there. The other thing about black men, and then even these black people who voted for Trump, some of it was evangelicals. Yeah. Some of it. We have to be, we in the church. Let's talk about some of the evangelicals. And I had an argument with one because they were talking about Trump was anti-abortion. I mean, Trump was anti-abortion. Huh? And so I say, is that the most important commandment in the Bible about thou shalt not kill unborn babies, but you don't care about the people who are being killed trying to come in this country, running from oppression other places? You don't care about black boys being shot down by police? This is not important to you. And so they drilled that in them, that this is the most important reason why you should go out to vote, because Trump does not support abortion, and that's the worst sin. And I don't know where that came from, Pastor. I don't know where we find that in the Bible. But
Trump does support.
But the other thing I think we really need to look at is how do we take the states and the cities back? That's right. That's really what we have to look at, because when you look at the midterm election, is that there are 9 Democratic seats that's up. 9 Republican seats that are up for election, and only 2 of those I think in states, or maybe only one is in a state that Hillary won. Yeah. 2 are in states where Trump
came really close.
Came close. But 30, I think it's about 30 Democratic senators are up for re-election, and some of them are vulnerable. They're in places like Montana. Yeah. And so the hopes of taking the Senate and the House back, and they've already gerrymandered the House to the point that until you get the next census, except people just voting against Trump, that's the only way you're going to get the House back the next time around. So let's look at, we have 2 governor's races this year, Virginia and New Jersey. Right. You have I don't know how many big city elections this year.
6.
And so we need to look at
Atlanta
how do
about
you,
to have a white mayor. Let's just say it. In 40 years, the city of Atlanta has been governed by an African American. And this year, a white woman is about to become mayor of the city of Atlanta because more people would rather put their name on the ballot for name recognition than get out of the race and support a really good candidate. So those are the
Well, we
kind of
just saw that in
conversations.
St. Louis. You just saw that in St. Louis.
These are the kind of
We split the vote.
conversations I think we need to be having in our communities. And the last two things I'll say, and I know Jameer will agree, we ain't talked about millennials. And we all, as a person, and I know Jameer would agree, as a person who literally worked on a campaign, who's worked multiple campaigns, whose job it is to go in the room, not only give the message, but interact with people. We keep saying we want folks to come to our communities with diverse messages and and come to our communities and talk to us in the totality of who we are. But we consistently come to the table only asking about criminal justice reform. Consistently. And then we won off jobs on the back end. We won off a little bit of education. So I also think that we have to have some tough conversations with our people in the rooms about what we're coming to the table about. And yes, it is a disgrace, it is a travesty, and we have to do something about the fact that unarmed black and brown people are being shot and killed in the streets, are being targeted. But we also got to do something about environmental justice. And the fact that if you go into a first grade classroom in the inner city right now and ask the kids to raise their hand, if you or you know somebody that has asthma, every single hand is going to go up.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's why it's important that tomorrow in this city, there will be the march for climate change and environmental justice.
But why are we still marching? And they ain't got no strategy.
Hold on.
I don't want to go to another march.
Everybody's marching. And the hip hop caucus.
I'm so tired of a march.
And the hip hop caucus is also part of that. And listen, marches is nothing but an expression.
But there are other ways to express.
I need you to show up in the
There are other ways to express. There are other ways to express. We really have to deal with some of these economic issues. See, I'm tired of marching too. I want to talk about the way that we deal with our economy.
But I want to point out to people that the reason why Indivisible was able to ride the back of the Women's March was because the women got out there and marched and put 5 million people in the streets. I don't want us to get confused about how power and influence works. It works at a lot of different issues, and invisibility is a deadly factor to any movement. Movements that try to sit around and think they can do it all in the dark don't work. I also wanted to say a couple things. It's not an opinion about why Trump voters voted the way they did. The research is out there. But before the vote happened in 2015, Algernon Austin, powerful brother economist, put out a really good book called We Are Not Post-Racial, where he looked at Trump voters. I mean, he looked at, the Obama voters and predicted that they would flip and talked about all of these kinds of factors that we haven't, really dealt with on race. But I also wanted to make sure that everybody know that this week, Voice opened. Does anybody know what Voice is? Voice is, when we're talking about hate crimes, where we started this whole conversation. Voice is the Victims of Immigrant Crime Engagement Office, ICE, part of the Department of Homeland Security. And all it's going to do for the next 3.5 years is propagate hate. It's going to propagate hate about African Americans, about Somalians, about Mexicans, about anybody who is an immigrant, because they are required to publish, quote, crime data.
That's right.
Right, proud immigrant, you're right. And she's making the conversation about the Euro immigrants, right. They're different. And to put out that data, constantly to propagate hate. There is, we gotta, I'm just amazed that this week there wasn't a greater outcry against that, because that's gonna affect every one of us.
People was out too busy planning their marches.
No. They
Well, hold it. Ben's got to go because his son is under the weather. He's got to go early. So, Ben, why don't you say...
Tell him about the marches, Ben,
say
before
what
you
you
go.
need to do, and then we'll...
Well, you had enough of
March got to have a strategy behind it, but all right.
Well, no, thank you, Mark. One thing that unites both of us is that we're working dads. I'm sorry, y'all got to get home, relieve the babysitter. My son has strep throat. He's 4. He's very cute. But I would say this, y'all. I would say this. You know, we are organizers, and we have lived through many different moments in our country's history. And we are back. I'd say our nation, in many ways, has reverted back to its mean as far as the state, for instance, of the Supreme Court. And as organizers, we are in a place where we have to defend minority rights with majority votes. And that's why we need to organize and actually pull communities together, because it's the only way that we're going to win these days. Thank you, and God bless.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Ben.
Ben. Ben Trevor.